In microeconomics, supply and demand is an economic model of price determination in a market. It postulates that holding all else equal in a competitive market, the unit price for a particular good or other traded item, such as labor or liquid financial assets, will vary until it settles at a point where the quantity demanded at the current price will equal the quantity supplied at the current price, resulting in an economic equilibrium for price and quantity transacted. The concept of supply and demand forms the theoretical basis of modern economics. In macroeconomics as well, the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model has been used to depict how the quantity of total output and the aggregate price level may be determined in equilibrium. A supply schedule, depicted graphically as a supply curve, is a table that shows the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity supplied by producers. Under the assumption of perfect competition, supply is determined by marginal cost. Firms will produce additional output as long as the cost of producing an extra unit is less than the market price they receive. A rise in the cost of raw materials would decrease supply, shifting the supply curve to the left because at each possible price, a smaller quantity would be supplied. One may also think of this as a shift up in the supply curve because the price must rise for producers to supply a given quantity. A fall in production costs would increase supply, shifting the supply curve to the right and down. By its very nature, the concept of a supply curve assumes that firms are perfect competitors having no influence over the market price. This is because each point on the supply curve answers the question, if this firm is faced with this potential price, how much output will it sell? If a firm has market power, in violation of the perfect competitor model, its decision on how much output to bring to market influences the market price. Thus, the firm is not faced with any given price in a more complicated model. Just as the supply curve parallels the marginal cost curve, the demand curve parallels marginal utility measured in dollars. Consumers will be willing to buy a given quantity of a good at a given price if the marginal utility of additional consumption is equal to the opportunity cost determined by the price, that is, the marginal utility of alternative consumption choices. The demand schedule is defined as the willingness and ability of a consumer to purchase a given product at a certain time. The demand curve is generally downward sloping, but for some goods, it is upward sloping. Two such types of goods have been given definitions and names that are in common use. Veblen goods, goods which, because of fashion or signaling, are more attractive at higher prices, and Giffen goods which, by virtue of being inferior goods, that absorb a large part of a consumer's income. A staples such as the classic example of potatoes in Ireland, may see an increase in quantity demanded when the price rises. The reason the law of the demand is violated for Giffen goods is that the rise in the price of the good has a strong income effect, sharply reducing the purchasing power of the consumer so that he switches away from luxury goods to the Giffen good. When the price of potatoes rises, the Irish peasant can no longer afford meat and eats more potatoes to cover for the lost calories. As with the supply curve, by its very nature, the concept of a demand curve requires that the purchaser be a perfect competitor. That is, that the purchaser have no influence over the market price. Partial equilibrium, as the name suggests, takes into consideration only a part of the market to attain equilibrium. Jane proposes, attributed to George Stigler, a partial equilibrium is one which is based on only a restricted range of data. A standard example is price of a single product. The prices of all other products being held fixed during the analysis. The supply and demand model is a partial equilibrium model of economic equilibrium, where the clearance on the market of some specific goods is obtained independently from prices and quantities in other markets. In other words, the prices of all substitutes and complements, as well as income levels of consumers, are constant. This makes analysis much simpler than in a general equilibrium model, which includes an entire economy. Here, the dynamic process is that prices adjust until supply equals demand. It is a powerfully simple technique that allows one to study equilibrium, efficiency, and comparative statics. The stringency of the simplifying assumptions inherent in this approach makes the model considerably more tractable, but may produce results which, while seemingly precise, do not effectively model real world economic phenomena. Partial equilibrium analysis examines the effects of policy action in creating equilibrium only in that particular sector or market which is directly affected, ignoring its in any other market or industry, assuming that they, being small, will have little impact, if any. Hence, this analysis is considered to be useful in constricted markets. Leon Walras first formalized the idea of a one-period economic equilibrium of the general economic system, but it was French economist Antoine-Augustin Cournot and English political economist Alfred Marshall who developed tractable models to analyze an economic system. The model of supply and demand also applies to various specialty markets. The model is commonly applied to wages in the market for labor. The typical roles of supplier and demander are reversed. The suppliers are individuals who try to sell their labor for the highest price. The demanders of labor are businesses which try to buy the type of labor they need at the lowest price. The equilibrium price for a certain type of labor is the wage rate. However, economist Steve Fleetwood revisited the empirical reality of supply and demand curves in labor markets and concluded that the evidence is at best inconclusive and at worst casts doubt on their existence. Compared to microeconomic uses of demand and supply, different and more controversial, theoretical considerations apply to such macroeconomic counterparts as aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Demand and supply are also used in macroeconomic theory to relate money supply and money demand to interest rates and to relate labor supply and labor demand to wage rates. The 256th couplet of Tyro Cruall, which was composed at least 2,000 years ago, says that if people do not consume a product or service, then there will not be anybody to supply that product or service for the sake of price. According to Hamid S. Hosseini, the power of supply and demand was understood to some extent by several early Muslim scholars, such as 14th century Syrian scholar Ibn Taymiyyah, who wrote, "If desire for goods increases while its availability decreases, its price rises. On the other hand, if availability of the good increases and the desire for it decreases, the price comes down. If desire for goods increases while its availability decreases, its price rises. On the other hand, if availability of the good increases and the desire for it decreases, the price comes down." Shifting focus to the English etymology of the expression, it has been confirmed that the phrase supply and demand was not used by English economics writers until after the end of the 17th century. In John Locke's 1691 work, Some Considerations on the Consequences of the Lowering of Interest and the Raising of the Value of Money, Locke alluded to the idea of supply and demand. However, he failed to accurately label it as such, and thus he fell short in coining the phrase and conveying its true significance. Locke wrote, "The price of any commodity rises or falls by the proportion of the number of buyer and sellers, and that which regulates the price is nothing else but their quantity in proportion to vent." Locke's terminology drew criticism from John Law. Law argued that the prices of goods are not according to the quantity in proportion to the vent, but in proportion to the demand. From Law, the demand part of the phrase was given its proper title, and it began to circulate among prominent authorities in the 1730s. In 1755, Francis Hutcheson, in his A System of Moral Philosophy, furthered development toward the phrase by stipulating that the prices of goods depend on these two jointly, the demand and the difficulty of acquiring. It was not until 1767 that the phrase supply and demand was first used by Scottish writer James Denham Stewart in his inquiry into the principles of political economy. He originated the use of this phrase by effectively combining supply and demand together in a number of different occasions such as price determination and competitive analysis. In Stewart's chapter entitled Of Demand, he argues that the nature of demand is to encourage industry, and when it is regularly made, the effect of it is that the supply for the most part is found to be in proportion to it, and then the demand is simple. It is presumably from this chapter that the idea spread to other authors and economic thinkers. Adam Smith used the phrase after Stewart in his 1776 book, The Wealth of Nations. In The Wealth of Nations, Smith asserted that the supply price was fixed, but that its merit value would decrease as its scarcity increased. This idea by Smith was later named the law of demand. In 1803, Thomas Robert Malthus used the phrase supply and demand 20 times in the second edition of the essay on population. And David Ricardo, in his 1817 work, Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, titled one chapter on the influence of demand and supply on price. In Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, Ricardo more rigorously laid down the idea of the assumptions that were used to build his ideas of supply and demand. In 1838, Antoine Augustin Cournot developed a mathematical model of supply and demand in his researches into the mathematical principles of wealth. It included diagrams. It is important to note that the use of the phrase was still rare, and only a few examples of more than 20 uses in a single work have been identified by the end of the second decade of the 19th century. During the late 19th century, the marginalist school of thought emerged. The main innovators of this approach were Stanley Jevons, Carl Menger, and Leon Walras. The key idea was that the price was set by the subjective value of a good at the margin. This was a substantial change from Adam Smith's thoughts on determining the supply price. In his 1870 essay on the graphical representation of supply and demand, Fleming Jenkins, in the course of Introduct the Diagrammatic Method into the English Economic Literature, published the first drawing of supply and demand curves in English, including comparative statics from a shift of supply or demand and application to the labor market. The model was further developed and popularized by Alfred Marshall in the 1890 textbook Principles of Economics. The philosopher Hans Albert has argued that the ceteris paribus conditions of the marginalist theory rendered the theory itself an empty tautology and completely closed to experimental testing. In essence, he argues, the supply and demand curves, theoretical functions which express the quantity of a product which would be offered or requested for a given price, are purely ontological. Schaeffer's critique focused on the inconsistency, except in implausible circumstances, of partial equilibrium analysis and the rationale for the upward slope of the supply curve in a market for a produced consumption good. The notability of Schaeffer's critique is also demonstrated by Paul Samuelson's comments and engagements with it over many years. For example, modern post-Keynesians criticize the supply and demand model for failing to explain the prevalence of administered prices in which retail prices are set by firms primarily based on a markup over normal average unit costs and aren't responsive to changes in demand up to capacity. Some economists criticize the conventional supply and demand theory for failing to explain or anticipate asset bubbles that can arise from a positive feedback loop. Conventional supply and demand theory assumes that expectations of consumers do not change as a consequence of price changes. In scenarios such as the United States housing bubble, an initial price change of an asset can increase the expectations of investors, making the asset more lucrative and contributing to further price increases until market sentiment changes, which creates a positive feedback loop and an asset bubble. Asset bubbles cannot be understood in the conventional supply and demand framework because the conventional system assumes a price change will be self-correcting and the system will snap back to equilibrium. Paul Cockshott's critique focuses on the unfalsifiability of the neoclassical model. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to please like and subscribe. If you have a topic you would like to suggest, leave a comment.